The funeral home was quiet except for the soft sound of sodding. The air was heavy with sadness as family and friends gathered to say their final goodbyes to Daniel, a loving father and friend to many. His sudden passing had left everyone in shock. At the center of the room stood a small casket surrounded by flowers, the scent of lilies filling the air. Inside the casket lay Daniel, dressed in a black suit, his face calm as though he were only sleeping. Amelia, his 7-year-old daughter, stood close to her mother, Sarah, holding her hand tightly. She wore a white dress, her puffy eyes red from crying. She didn't fully understand what had happened to her father. All she knew was that he wasn't coming home anymore, and that thought made her heart ache. She had always thought of her father as her hero, someone who could fix anything and protect her from the world. Seeing him lying so still scared her. "Can I go to him, Mommy?" Amelia asked in a soft voice, her eyes wide with sadness. Sarah hesitated, her own tears falling. She knelt down to Amelia's level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Of course, sweetheart, you can say goodbye." Amelia let go of her mother's hand and slowly walked toward the casket, her tiny footsteps echoing in the room. The adults in the room watched silently, their hearts breaking for the little girl. She stopped in front of her father and reached up, placing her small hand on his face. It felt cold, not like the warm hugs she was used to. A tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, "Daddy, please wake up." The room was so quiet that her words could be heard clearly by everyone. Amelia leaned closer, her lips trembling. "I need you, Daddy. Don't leave me." She rested her head on his chest, as she often did when they would sit on the couch together at home. Her small arms wrapped around him in a gentle hug. The sight brought tears to everyone's eyes. It was a moment of pure, innocent love, a child holding on to the hope that her father would somehow return. Sarah walked over to her daughter, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Amelia," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's time to let go." Amelia looked up at her mother, her big eyes filled with pain. But what if he wakes up? What if he's just sleeping? Sarah knelt beside her, pulling her into a hug. "I know it's hard, sweetheart, but Daddy isn't coming back. He's in a better place now." Amelia sniffled and nodded, though her heart didn't want to accept it. She gave her father one last hug before stepping back. As she did, something strange happened. A faint warmth seemed to linger in the air, and for a moment, it felt as though the room held its breath. Some of the mourners exchanged glances, sensing the unusual stillness. Amelia, too young to notice, stayed close to her mother, holding onto her dress tightly. But deep inside, she felt a tiny spark of hope, as though her words might have reached her father somehow. The funeral home grew quieter as the service continued. People shared stories about Daniel, how he was a kind man, always helping others, and how he adored his daughter, Amelia. Laughter mixed with tears as they remembered his warm smile and the way he could brighten a room. But even with the comforting words, the weight of loss hung heavy in the air. Amelia sat beside her mother, clutching a small teddy bear her father had given her on her last birthday. Her tiny fingers traced the stitching on its paw as her mind wandered. She thought about the mornings when her dad would make her pancakes shaped like hearts, or how he'd read her bedtime stories in funny voices, making her giggle until she couldn't breathe. She missed him so much that her chest felt tight, like it was hard to breathe. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging at Sarah's sleeve. "Why did Daddy have to go away?" Sarah looked down at her daughter, her heart breaking all over again. How could she explain something so painful to a child? "Sometimes, sweetheart, things happen that we can't control. Daddy didn't want to leave us. He loved you more than anything in the whole world." Amelia nodded, her lips quivering. "Do you think he can hear me if I talk to him?" Sarah paused, then gave a small, tearful smile. "I think he can, Amelia. I think he'll always be listening to you." That gave Amelia a bit of comfort. She looked toward the casket where her father rested and decided she wanted to talk to him one more time. She stood up, the teddy bear still clutched in her hands, and walked back to the front of the room. The adults watched her again, their faces soft with sympathy and curiosity. She stood on her tiptoes to see her father's face. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling but full of love. "It's me, Amelia. I know you're sleeping, but I wanted to tell you something." She hesitated, taking a deep breath. "I love you so much, and I miss you. Please don't forget me, okay?" Her words made the room feel heavy with emotion. Some people wiped their eyes, unable to hold back their tears. Amelia leaned forward and placed the teddy bear beside her father. "I brought you my bear so you won't be lonely," she said softly. "You can keep it, Daddy." As she stepped back, something strange happened. A faint sound, like a small sigh, seemed to come from the casket. Amelia froze, her eyes widening. She turned to her mother. "Mommy, did you hear that?" Sarah blinked, confused. "Hear what, sweetheart?" "That sound. It was Daddy. I think he made a sound." Amelia's voice was filled with both hope and uncertainty. The room fell silent as everyone listened. A faint whisper of movement came from the casket. One of the mourners gasped, and others exchanged nervous glances. "It's probably nothing," someone murmured, but there was an undeniable tension in the air. Amelia's heart raced as she stared at her father's face. "Please, Daddy," she whispered again. "Come back." Sarah knelt beside her, holding her close. "Amelia, sometimes our hearts want something so much that it feels real. But your daddy is at peace now." But deep in her heart, Amelia wasn't so sure. Something felt different, something she couldn't explain. And for the first time since the funeral began, a tiny spark of hope flickered in the room. The funeral service continued, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Amelia's words and the strange sound from the casket had left everyone on edge, their grief momentarily replaced by curiosity and unease. Some dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a noise from the room, or even wishful thinking. But for Amelia, that faint sound had been real, and it had stirred something deep inside her, a small, unshakable hope. Amelia sat back down beside her mother, her hands clutching the edge of her dress. She kept glancing at the casket, her young mind racing with questions. "Mommy," she whispered, tugging at Sarah's sleeve again. "What if Daddy isn't really gone?" Sarah's heart ached at her daughter's words. She placed a hand gently on Amelia's shoulder. "Sweetheart, I know this is hard to understand, but when someone passes away, they don't come back." "But I heard him," Amelia insisted, her voice soft but firm. "I think he's still here." Sarah didn't know how to respond. She wanted to comfort Amelia, but she also didn't want to give her false hope. Instead, she pulled her daughter close, letting her rest her head on her shoulder. "Your daddy will always be with us in our hearts," she said gently. As the service neared its end, the guests began to prepare for the final farewell. The funeral director stepped forward to begin closing the casket. Amelia's eyes widened, and she leaped up from her seat. "Wait," she cried, running toward the front of the room. The director froze, startled by her sudden outburst. The room fell silent, all eyes on the little girl standing protectively in front of the casket. Sarah rushed to her side, kneeling down to calm her. "Amelia, what's wrong?" Sarah asked, her voice full of concern. "Don't close it yet," Amelia said, her voice trembling. "I need to check something." Sarah hesitated but nodded to the funeral director to wait. She turned back to Amelia. "What do you want to check, sweetheart?" Amelia's small hands gripped the edge of the casket as she peered inside. She stared at her father's face, searching for any sign of movement. The room was so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning could be heard. Amelia reached out and gently touched her father's hand. It still felt cold, but she refused to give up. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If you can hear me, please let me know. I don't want you to go." Everyone watched, holding their breath. Some looked on with pity, others with quiet curiosity. And then, just as Amelia began to lose hope, a faint movement caught her eye. Her father's fingers twitched, ever so slightly. Amelia gasped, pulling back her hand. He moved, she cried, her voice filled with shock and excitement. The guests murmured in disbelief, craning their necks to see. The funeral director stepped closer, his face pale. "It's not possible," he whispered, but his hands trembled as he checked for a pulse. To everyone's astonishment, a faint, irregular heartbeat could be felt. "Call an ambulance," the director shouted, breaking the stunned silence. Chaos erupted as people scrambled to act, but Amelia stayed rooted to the spot, her wide eyes fixed on her father. Sarah knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. "Amelia, I don't know how, but you were right." The room buzzed with confusion and awe, but Amelia didn't care. For the first time in days, she felt something other than sadness, hope. As paramedics rushed in to take Daniel to the hospital, Amelia whispered one last time, "I knew you could hear me, Daddy." And for the briefest moment, she thought she saw the corners of his mouth lift into the faintest of smiles. The room was a blur of movement as the paramedics wheeled Daniel's casket out of the funeral home. People whispered in shock, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Amelia clung to her mother's hand, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. Could it really be true? Was her father alive? Sarah followed closely behind the paramedics, holding Amelia tightly as they stepped into the ambulance. Amelia's small face was pressed against her mother's side, but her eyes stayed fixed on her father. She noticed his chest rising and falling, barely visible under the thin fabric of his suit. Her heart fluttered. This wasn't her imagination. Something amazing was happening. The paramedics worked quickly, attaching monitors and oxygen masks to Daniel. One of them, a kind-looking man with glasses, knelt down beside Amelia and Sarah. "I don't know how to explain this," he said, his voice steady but filled with awe. "His heart is beating, but it's very weak. It's like he was waiting for something." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she hugged Amelia tightly. "Waiting for us," she whispered. Amelia looked up at the paramedic, her voice small but firm. "I talked to him. I told him to come back. Maybe he heard me." The paramedic smiled gently, patting her shoulder. "Sometimes love can do amazing things." The ambulance sped toward the hospital, its sirens cutting through the quiet streets. Amelia sat quietly beside her mother, holding the teddy bear she had placed in the casket earlier. "Do you think Daddy is going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sarah brushed a tear from her cheek and stroked Amelia's hair. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I believe he's fighting to come back to us." When they arrived at the hospital, Daniel was rushed into the emergency room. Amelia and Sarah were taken to a waiting area, where time seemed to stretch endlessly. Sarah held Amelia close, whispering soothing words to keep her calm. But Amelia's mind was racing. She thought about the stories her dad used to tell her at bedtime, how heroes always found a way to come back, no matter how tough the battle. After what felt like hours, a doctor finally approached them. His face was serious, but his eyes held a glimmer of something Amelia couldn't quite place. "Your husband is alive," he said to Sarah, "but we don't understand how." His heart stopped for a significant amount of time. Cases like this are extremely rare. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. "Can we see him?" she asked. The doctor nodded. "He's still unconscious, but his vital signs are stable. It's nothing short of a miracle." Amelia's eyes lit up as she tugged on her mother's hand. "I told you, Mommy. I knew he could hear me." They followed the doctor into the hospital room, where Daniel lay hooked up to machines. His face looked peaceful, and Amelia thought he seemed more like himself. She climbed onto a chair beside his bed, taking his hand in her own. "Hi, Daddy," she whispered. "I'm here." Sarah placed a hand on Daniel's other side, her tears falling freely now. "We're both here," she said softly. "Take your time, but come back to us." As they sat together, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the room. Amelia refused to let go of her father's hand, her heart filled with hope. For the first time in days, she felt like her family might just be whole again. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Amelia sat beside her father's bed, holding his hand tightly. Her small fingers gently traced the lines of his palm, just as she used to when he read her bedtime stories. Sarah sat on the other side, watching her daughter with a mix of amazement and hope. Despite the machines and wires, Daniel looked peaceful, as though he were only asleep. "Mommy," Amelia whispered, breaking the silence. "Do you think Daddy knows we're here?" Sarah smiled softly, brushing Amelia's hair away from her face. "I think he does, sweetheart. I think he's trying to come back to us." Amelia nodded, her gaze fixed on her father. She leaned closer, resting her head on the edge of the bed. "I told him I love him," she murmured. "Do you think he heard me?" Sarah's voice wavered as she replied, "I think your love is stronger than anything else, Amelia. Maybe it's what brought him back." Amelia's heart swelled with determination. She believed her mother's words completely. "Then I'll keep talking to him," she said firmly. Turning her attention to her father, she began to speak softly. "Daddy, it's me, Amelia. I'm right here. Mommy's here too. We're waiting for you to wake up." The sound of her voice filled the room with warmth, and even the nurses who came in to check on Daniel paused to listen. It wasn't just words. It was love, pure and unshakable, flowing from a little girl who refused to give up on her dad. Hours passed, but Amelia never left her father's side. She told him stories about her favorite moments with him. The time he taught her how to ride a bike, the time they built a snowman together, and how he always made the best pancakes on Saturday mornings. With each story, her voice grew steadier, her hope stronger. Sarah watched her daughter in awe. Amelia's unwavering faith reminded her of how Daniel had always been with them. Strong, dependable, and full of love. She reached across the bed and placed her hand over Daniel's. "We're here," she whispered, "whenever you're ready." As the day turned to evening, something incredible happened. Amelia felt a faint movement in her father's fingers. Her eyes widened, and she gasped, looking up at Sarah. "Mommy." He moved. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she leaned closer, watching Daniel's hand. The faint twitch became stronger, and then his eyelids fluttered. A quiet gasp escaped Sarah's lips, and she reached for the call button to alert the nurses. "Daddy," Amelia whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "Can you hear me?" Daniel's eyes opened slowly, blinking as he adjusted to the light. His gaze settled on Amelia, and his lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "Hey, princess," he said weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia burst into tears, throwing her arms around him carefully. "Daddy, you're back." Sarah covered her mouth, overcome with emotion, as she watched the impossible unfold before her eyes. The nurses rushed in, their faces a mixture of shock and joy as they checked Daniel's vitals. He was weak but alive. Against all odds, he had come back. As Amelia held on to her father, she whispered, "I knew you could hear me. I knew you'd come back." And for the first time in days, the room was filled with something other than sadness. It was filled with hope, love, and the unshakable bond of a family that refused to let go. Daniel's return felt like a miracle, not just to his family, but to everyone who had witnessed the unbelievable. As the nurses adjusted his monitors and checked his vitals, Daniel's eyes never left Amelia and Sarah. His voice was weak, but his first words were filled with emotion. "I heard you," he whispered, looking at Amelia. "Your voice, it brought me back." Amelia's heart swelled with joy, her tears spilling over. "I knew you could hear me, Daddy," she said, gripping his hand tightly. "I never stopped talking to you." Sarah, still overcome with emotion, leaned over and kissed Daniel's forehead. "You scared us," she said, her voice breaking. "But you're here. That's all that matters." Daniel managed a faint smile, though his body was clearly exhausted. The doctors arrived shortly after, their faces a mixture of awe and curiosity. One of them, an older man with kind eyes, stepped forward and addressed the family. "This is extraordinary," the doctor said, looking at Daniel. "Your heart had stopped for a long time. Cases like this are extremely rare. We can't explain how you're here, but we'll do everything we can to help you recover." Daniel nodded weakly, his gaze shifting back to Amelia. "It wasn't just science," he murmured. "It was her. I could hear her voice, calling me back." The doctor glanced at Amelia, his expression softening. "Sometimes, love can be more powerful than we realize," he said gently. "Whatever the reason, you're here, and that's what matters." Over the next few days, Daniel's condition gradually improved. Though he was still weak, his strength returned little by little. Amelia refused to leave his side, sitting by his bed and continuing to tell him stories. She talked about everything: her favorite toys, her friends at school, and how much she missed his pancakes. Daniel listened to every word, smiling as much as his energy allowed. "You're my little storyteller," he said one evening, his voice stronger than it had been before. "You've always had a way with words." Amelia beamed at the compliment. "And you're my hero, Daddy. You came back to us." Sarah watched them with tears in her eyes. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, but seeing Daniel alive and smiling filled her with gratitude she couldn't put into words. She reached over and took his hand. "We're going to get through this," she said firmly. "Together." Daniel squeezed her hand lightly, his smile growing. "I wouldn't have it any other way." News of Daniel's miraculous recovery began to spread. Friends, neighbors, and even the funeral director who had witnessed the event visited the hospital, all eager to hear the story. Everyone marveled at how Amelia's unwavering love had played a role in bringing her father back. It was a story that touched hearts and inspired hope. For Daniel, every moment with his family now felt like a gift. He promised himself that he would cherish every second, knowing how close he had come to losing it all. And for Amelia, her belief in the power of love grew stronger than ever. She knew, without a doubt, that her voice had reached her father in his darkest moment and brought him back into the light. As the family prepared to leave the hospital, Daniel looked at Sarah and Amelia, his heart full of gratitude. "I'm not going anywhere," he said with a determined smile. "I've got too much to live for." And with those words, the three of them stepped into the future together, stronger and more united than ever before. The day Daniel was discharged from the hospital was filled with emotion. Amelia held tightly to her father's hand as they walked out into the warm sunlight. Sarah was beside them, her heart light with relief and joy. It felt like a new beginning, a second chance for their family. "Are you sure you're okay, Daddy?" Amelia asked, looking up at him with wide eyes. Daniel smiled down at her, his steps slow but steady. "I'm okay, sweetheart. A little tired, but I feel stronger every day." Amelia's face lit up with excitement. "When we get home, can we make pancakes like we used to? I've missed your special ones with the smiley faces." Daniel chuckled softly, squeezing her hand. "Of course, Princess. Pancakes are the first thing on my list." As they got into the car, Sarah glanced at Daniel, her expression tender. "You really scared us," she said quietly. "I don't think I'll ever forget that moment in the funeral home." Daniel's smile faded slightly, replaced by a thoughtful look. "Neither will I," he said. "I can't explain it, Sarah. I remember being in this quiet place. It was peaceful, like nothing I've ever felt before. But then I heard Amelia's voice. It was so clear, like she was right there with me. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't leave." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she reached over to place a hand on his. "She never stopped believing in you. None of us did." The drive home was quiet but filled with unspoken gratitude. When they arrived, Amelia ran inside, eager to show her father everything he had missed. "Look, Daddy," she called, holding up a drawing she had made. It was a picture of their family, with a big heart around all three of them. Daniel knelt down, still a little unsteady, and took the drawing from her. "This is beautiful, Amelia," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "I'm going to keep this forever." Amelia grinned and hugged him tightly. "I'm so happy you're home, Daddy." Later that evening, the family gathered in the kitchen. True to his word, Daniel made his famous smiley face pancakes, though Sarah had to help him a bit with the cooking. Amelia giggled as she watched her father try to flip a pancake and almost drop it. "Careful, Daddy," she said, laughing. "We just got you back. Don't burn yourself." Daniel laughed along with her, his heart full. For the first time in what felt like forever, their home was filled with warmth and laughter again. As the evening wore on, Daniel and Sarah sat on the couch while Amelia played with her toys on the floor. Daniel leaned back, his arm around Sarah, and sighed contentedly. "I've never been more thankful for anything in my life," he said. "Being here with you both, it's all I need." Sarah rested her head on his shoulder, her smile soft. "We're thankful too," she said. "Every moment feels like a gift now." Amelia looked up from her toys and smiled at her parents. "We're a team," she said brightly, "and nothing can break us." Daniel reached out and ruffled her hair. "That's right, Princess. Nothing." As the day came to a close, the family sat together, feeling stronger and closer than ever. They knew life would have its challenges, but they also knew that their love could overcome anything. It was a day they would always remember, a day filled with hope, gratitude, and the unshakable bond of family. The days following Daniel's return home were filled with a mix of healing, gratitude, and small, joyful moments. Each morning, Amelia would race into her father's room, eager to check on him. She'd climb onto the bed and snuggle beside him, her giggles filling the air as she whispered, "Good morning, Daddy. Are you ready to make more pancakes today?" Daniel, still regaining his strength, would laugh softly and ruffle her hair. "Not every morning, Princess. I think even pancake masters need a day off." Amelia would pout dramatically, but always end up laughing too. For her, just having her father there, smiling and talking to her, was enough. Sarah worked tirelessly to keep the household running smoothly while also ensuring Daniel had everything he needed. She helped him with his medication, made his favorite meals, and encouraged him to rest when he pushed himself too hard. But more than anything, she simply enjoyed having him back. The fear of losing him had changed her perspective on life, making her appreciate even the smallest, quietest moments. One evening, the family sat in the living room, watching one of Amelia's favorite animated movies. Amelia had curled up next to Daniel, her head resting on his chest as he absent-mindedly stroked her hair. Sarah sat nearby, smiling as she watched the two of them. "Daddy," Amelia said softly, her voice breaking the comfortable silence. "Do you remember what I said to you at the funeral?" Daniel nodded, his eyes softening. "I do, sweetheart. I remember every word." Amelia tilted her head to look up at him. "When I said I loved you, I hoped it would help. Did it?" Daniel's throat tightened, and he paused for a moment before replying. "It didn't just help, Amelia. It saved me. I heard your voice, and it gave me the strength to come back. You brought me home." Amelia's eyes grew wide, and she smiled brightly. "I knew it," she said, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. "I knew you could hear me." Sarah wiped away a tear as she listened. "Amelia, your love for your dad is stronger than anything. We're so lucky to have you." Amelia's cheeks flushed with pride. "We're lucky to have Daddy, too," she said, looking at him with a big grin. Daniel hugged his daughter close, his heart swelling with emotion. "You're right, Amelia. We're all lucky to have each other." The days turned into weeks, and Daniel grew stronger with each passing day. The family found a new rhythm, one filled with gratitude for their second chance. They made more pancakes, played board games at the kitchen table, and took slow walks in the park, enjoying the fresh air and each other's company. Word of Daniel's recovery continued to spread, and people often stopped him in town to tell him how his story had inspired them. He would smile and tell them the truth. It wasn't just a miracle. It was my family. Their love brought me back. As they sat together one quiet evening, Sarah reached for Daniel's hand. "I never thought we'd get this time with you," she said softly. "It feels like a gift." Daniel nodded, his gaze full of warmth. "It is a gift, and I'm going to make the most of every moment." Amelia, sitting between them, grinned. "That's because we're the best team ever." Daniel laughed and kissed the top of her head. "That's right, princess. And no matter what, we'll always have each other." As the family settled in for the night, the house was filled with a sense of peace and love. They had faced the unimaginable and come out stronger, proving that with hope, faith, and love, even the most impossible challenges could be overcome.